As promised, we are getting reaction around this matter. Let's discuss this latest development further now with SABC International News editor Sophie Mokoena. Sophie, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Well, as the presidency statement said, it is by mutual agreement that Putin will not be attending the much anticipated and awaited, summit. How did the two parties actually arrive at this decision?
You know, Unachi, the president and President Putin have been discussing this issue. We know that South Africa's view was that because South Africa is a signatory to the Rome Statute, there's no way they can allow someone with a warrant of arrest to descend or to touch down in South Africa, because South Africa would be compelled to arrest that person. You know that we domesticated the Rome Statute, and therefore President Ramaphosa has been engaging with Kremlin to try and find a solution. And you know that when I spoke to the former South African President Thabo Mbeki 2 months ago in Guinea, he pointed out at the options that South Africa was gonna look at, because there was no way South Africa would have taken a risk of having President Putin in the country, because then South Africa will be violating its own laws if they were to do that. And therefore, yesterday, I spoke to a number of people about this issue. One leader I spoke to is the former South African President Kgalema Motlanthe, and he gave me an example in relation to the options that South Africa can opt for, speaking to Kremlin but agreeing with President Putin. Let's take a listen at what the former President Kgalema Motlanthe had to say when I asked him what is South Africa supposed to do. He pointed out at perhaps a previous experience.
In 2009, as we were preparing for the inauguration of President Jacob Zuma, we were obliged to invite all heads of states and governments in the continent of Africa. And that's what we did. And then, of course, we did advise President al-Bashir that given the fact that we've domesticated the Rome statutes, these are our laws now, if he steps here, we would be obliged to arrest him. And he read the letter. He sent us a wonderful letter of apology, didn't turn up. So there's a way in which you can handle those things here.
And of course, Sophie, as you've also said, I mean, we've seen a number of engagements between President Cyril Ramaphosa as well as Vladimir Putin over some time, with the latest being just yesterday. What is Moscow saying at the moment?
Well, we haven't had a reaction from Moscow yet, but our colleagues in Moscow are chasing the office of President Vladimir Putin. Will bring you the reaction much later. And also Kaya Kumalo is trying to get a reaction from the delegation that came from Russia, who are here in the country representing different stakeholders in relation to the BRICS Summit of political parties. But yesterday again, I spoke to one senior member of the United Party in Russia. And when I spoke to him, he also pointed out that he's a member of the Supreme Council, almost like your NEC or your NWC, and therefore he's one of the senior leaders in Moscow. And then he pointed out that he is also a member of a Senate. But above all, he is the deputy chairman of the Commission for International Cooperation. In other words, he is almost the deputy to Sergey Lavrov. We heard earlier on that now the Foreign Affairs Minister, Sergey Lavrov, will be representing President Putin during the BRICS Summit. Let's take a listen at what he had to say about this issue.
We in Russia, we in Moscow, eager to improve BRICS organization and to support as much as possible during your presidency in BRICS organization, by all means. But you know, the situation around Russia is such that it is not so easy for us to arrange such trips. Anyhow, we will receive information as soon as possible from Moscow. But with where we are and we will friends of South Africa, that's for sure.
Sophie, now, although, the presidency statement didn't go into detail in terms of what are the pertinent issues that will be discussed in the BRICS Summit, the focus now is starting to shift, of course, to the Africa-Russia Summit that is happening at the end of this month. Now, is it going to be another important engagement, I would imagine, between Putin and the African leaders?
It is going to be very important because even this issue of BRICS, I think it's going to come up when President Cyril Ramaphosa is having a bilateral meeting with President Putin in terms of a way forward in future, how they avoid these issues. And the other important issue, you are aware that President Ramaphosa is part of the heads of state and government peace mission that went to Russia and Ukraine, and therefore they are going to continue to try and speak to President Putin to find a solution to this war that has affected so many countries around the world, including our own sub-Sahara region and South Africa in particular. And therefore this meeting is very important. And also you have other African leaders who will be at the summit, and therefore the issue of the Black Sea grain deal will be discussed. But yesterday when I spoke to Andre, he pointed out that there's misinformation. People don't understand that they took a decision not to renew the grain deal because when the agreement was signed in Turkey, it was facilitated by Turkey and the UN, the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres. He promised, or they promised, that they will speak to the Western powers, that Russia must also be able to sell its product, its grain, fertilizer, and gas, and they must get their money. But because of the economic sanctions imposed on Russia since the war, they are not able to access that money. Now, you find a situation that majority, the bulk of this grain is going to the European countries and the developed countries. The poorer countries that they are talking about get a little quota of what is being transported out of Eastern Europe. And therefore, if they don't pay us for our grain, for our fertilizer, and also for our gas, why are we supposed to facilitate this deal for Ukraine? And that's the sticky point. But he pointed out, and I remember very well one thing that when I'm speaking to other leaders, former President Mbeki again in Equatorial, in Guinea, he pointed out that he has been talking to people in Russia who are willing to give Africa fertilizers free. And also Kremlin has announced that they are willing to even give poorer countries the grain and the fertilizers free. And therefore, I think these are the issues that they are going to discuss. How do you ensure that that offer is able to be implemented? And therefore, I think that meeting is very, very important for the continent, but also in terms of taking forward the negotiations in trying to find a solution to this war in Ukraine. I saw before I came on air now that the president of Brazil, Lula, is also pointing out that he is now channeling his energy in trying to convince the two parties, Ukraine and Russia, to find a solution to this war. You know that China has got a 12-point plan. So you have the African mission, you have China 12-point plan, you have Brazil, you also have Europe and Ukraine having their own presentation, and you then have to pull together all these proposals so that you can find a solution to this war. And therefore the meeting of African heads of state and government in St. Petersburg in Russia next week will be very critical, and also for us, South Africa. Let's listen at what President Ramaphosa had to say. Yesterday, I was able to ask him when he was leaving the venue.
For me, it's a continuation of the discussions that we are having with President Putin about the war, but also for Africa is very important.
That's President Ramaphosa yesterday, but also tomorrow, Unati, the Department of International Relations is having a media engagement. The head of the diplomacy, Clayson Monyela, will be facilitating the discussions, and you'll have the DG of the department. You will also have Dr. Sidney Mufamadi. You know that he's the advisor to the president in relation to security. You'd recall when there was talk of this AGOA agreement with the Americans that hangs in the balance. He was sent to the United States of America to engage the Americans. And therefore you can see that there's a lot that South Africa has to deal with in relation to international perspective and diplomacy. And therefore tomorrow, I think we'll be able to ask questions on this issue, be it Russia-Africa Summit, BRICS, AGOA, and many other issues that are related to the war in Ukraine and the impact thereof.
Sophie, thank you so much for that analysis. Of course, you know, it has been, in essence, 4 months that we've been discussing this since the ICC issued that warrant of arrest in March this year. Of course, this has taken a lot of focus away from BRICS and just some of the, you know, the discussions that are pertinent and that need to be held. Well, thank you so much for that, Sophie. Of course, we continue to get analysis and also reaction around this mutual agreement that was Sophie Mokoena, international editor at the SABC.